The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Colonel James Mitchell stepped out of his black sedan, adjusting his crisp uniform with the practiced precision of a man who had spent 3 decades in service. At 52, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, his jaw set in perpetual authority, and his eyes scanning everything with the critical assessment of a career officer who had climbed every rung of the military ladder through sheer determination and unwavering discipline. The base bustled with early morning activity as soldiers hurried to their assignments, their boots creating a rhythmic symphony on the concrete pathways. Mitchell observed it all with satisfaction. This was his domain, Fort Harrison, where his word was law, and his reputation preceded him into every room. He had earned his position through blood, sweat, and an iron will that had never bent, not even during the darkest moments of his deployment in Afghanistan, where he had distinguished himself in combat operations that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. As he walked toward the administrative building, his aide, Captain Rodriguez, fell into step beside him. "Sir, we have the new liaison officer arriving today from the Pentagon. She's scheduled for the 1000 briefing." Mitchell's expression remained neutral, though internally he felt a familiar twinge of irritation. Pentagon liaisons were often young, ambitious officers who thought they understood field operations from behind a desk in Washington. In his experience, most of them were more concerned with political correctness and bureaucratic procedures than the real business of military leadership. He had dealt with dozens of them over the years, and they rarely impressed him. "What's her background?" Mitchell asked, his tone carrying the weight of a man who had already formed his opinion. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, sir. Graduated from West Point, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, currently working in strategic planning at the Pentagon." Mitchell nodded curtly. Another desk jockey with an impressive resume on paper, but probably lacking real command experience. He had seen it countless times before. The Pentagon loved to send these officers to various bases, ostensibly to improve coordination and communication, but, in reality, it was often just a way for ambitious officers to pad their service records with diverse assignments. The morning briefing room filled with the usual cast of department heads and senior officers. Mitchell took his place at the head of the conference table, his presence immediately commanding attention. The room fell silent as conversations died mid-sentence, replaced by the respectful attention that his rank and reputation demanded. At precisely 1000 hours, the door opened, and Captain Rodriguez announced, "Lieutenant Colonel Chun, sir." The woman who entered was not what Mitchell had expected. She was younger than he had anticipated, perhaps in her early 30s, with an athletic build that spoke of someone who took physical fitness seriously. Her uniform was impeccable, every crease sharp enough to cut, and she moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in her own skin. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dark eyes took in the room with an intelligence that immediately registered the dynamics at play. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun reporting as requested, sir," she said, offering a crisp salute that Mitchell returned with mechanical precision. "Take a seat, Colonel Chun," Mitchell said, gesturing to an empty chair midway down the table. He deliberately chose not to offer her a seat closer to his position, a subtle but unmistakable signal about the hierarchy he intended to maintain. As Chun settled into her chair, Mitchell began the briefing without preamble. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Chun is here from the Pentagon to observe our operations and provide feedback on our strategic implementation of current defense initiatives." His tone carried just enough emphasis on the word observe to make it clear that he viewed her role as largely ceremonial. Chun opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a tablet, her movements efficient and professional. "Thank you, Colonel Mitchell. I'm looking forward to learning about the excellent work being done here at Fort Harrison." Mitchell launched into his prepared presentation about base operations, speaking with the authority of someone who had managed every aspect of the facility for the past 4 years. He covered logistics, training programs, personnel management, and operational readiness with the thorough detail of a commander who knew his domain intimately. Throughout the presentation, Chun took notes on her tablet, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated a surprisingly deep understanding of military operations. Her questions were sharp and insightful, focusing on areas that many Pentagon liaisons typically overlooked. She inquired about equipment maintenance schedules, the psychological support programs for returning veterans, and the integration of new technology into existing training protocols. Despite himself, Mitchell found her questions more substantive than he had expected. Most liaison officers asked perfunctory questions about morale and budget allocations, safe topics that wouldn't challenge anyone or reveal their own lack of field experience. Chin's questions suggested someone who understood the complex interconnections of military operations and the human factors that often determine success or failure. After the formal briefing concluded, Mitchell suggested a tour of the facilities. As they walked through the various sections of the base, Chin observed everything with the keen eye of a professional evaluator, but she also interacted naturally with the enlisted personnel they encountered. She asked intelligent questions about their duties, listened carefully to their responses, and demonstrated a genuine interest in their welfare that seemed authentic rather than political. At the motor pool, she engaged in a technical discussion with Sergeant Williams about vehicle maintenance procedures that revealed an impressive knowledge of mechanical systems. At the communications center, she demonstrated familiarity with the latest encryption protocols that surprised even the specialists manning the equipment. With each interaction, Mitchell found himself grudgingly acknowledging that Chin appeared to have genuine expertise rather than just theoretical knowledge. However, her youth and gender continued to rankle him in ways he didn't fully acknowledge even to himself. In his generation of officers, women in combat roles had been rare, and those who succeeded had often done so by adopting an almost masculine approach to leadership. Chin seemed different. She was confident without being aggressive, knowledgeable without being condescending, and she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. During lunch in the officers' dining hall, the conversation turned to recent policy changes emanating from Washington. Several officers expressed frustration with new regulations they viewed as burdensome and disconnected from field realities. Chin listened carefully to their concerns, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood both the practical challenges they faced and the political considerations that had driven the policy changes. The problem with Washington, Major Thompson said, his voice carrying the frustration of a career officer who felt micromanaged from above, is that they make decisions without understanding what it's like to actually implement them in the field. Chin nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid concern, Major. The challenge is balancing the need for standardized procedures across all branches and installations with the reality that each base faces unique circumstances. What specific aspects of the new regulations are proving most problematic here? Mitchell watched this exchange with growing irritation. Chin was handling the criticism of Pentagon policies with diplomatic skill while simultaneously gathering intelligence about implementation challenges. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering he despised about Washington bureaucrats. They asked probing questions, gathered information, and then disappeared back to their offices to write reports that would likely result in more regulations and oversight. Colonel Chun, Mitchell interjected, his tone carrying an edge that made several officers look up from their meals. In my experience, most policy problems could be solved if Washington spent less time analyzing and more time trusting field commanders to do their jobs. Chun met his gaze directly, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the obvious challenge in his statement. That's certainly one perspective, Colonel Mitchell. In my experience, the most effective policies come from collaboration between field expertise and strategic oversight. Both perspectives bring valuable insights. The subtle correction in her response, treating his statement as merely one perspective rather than definitive truth, was delivered so diplomatically that it would have been difficult for anyone to take offense. Yet Mitchell felt the implicit challenge to his authority. Here was a lieutenant colonel, junior to him in rank, calmly suggesting that his views might be incomplete or biased. The remainder of the meal proceeded with polite, but noticeably cooler conversation. Mitchell found himself studying Chun more carefully, looking for signs of weakness or inexperience he could exploit to reassert his dominance in their professional relationship. However, she continued to demonstrate competence and knowledge that made such attacks difficult to justify. After lunch, they visited the training facilities where new recruits were undergoing basic combat exercises. Chun observed the training with professional interest, occasionally asking questions about methodology and assessment criteria. When one of the drill instructors demonstrated a new close-quarters combat technique, she watched with obvious familiarity. "Have you seen this technique before, ma'am?" the instructor asked respectfully. "Yes, Sergeant. We used a similar approach in Afghanistan, though we modified it for urban environments." Chin's response was matter-of-fact, without any hint of boastfulness, but it clearly indicated combat experience that matched or exceeded that of most officers on the base. Mitchell felt his jaw tighten. Combat experience was one of his strongest credentials, something that set him apart from the typical Pentagon bureaucrat. The casual way Chen referenced her own deployment suggested someone who had seen real action rather than just managing logistics from a forward operating base. As the afternoon progressed, Mitchell found himself increasingly frustrated by his inability to find obvious flaws in Chen's knowledge or performance. She handled every situation with professional competence, demonstrated genuine expertise across multiple areas of military operations, and interacted with personnel at all levels with appropriate respect and authority. During a visit to the communications center, Chen identified a potential security vulnerability in their network configuration that had been overlooked by the base's cybersecurity team. Her observation was delivered as a helpful suggestion rather than a criticism, but it nonetheless highlighted a genuine problem that could have had serious consequences if exploited by hostile actors. "How did you spot that so quickly?" asked Lieutenant Martinez, the communications officer responsible for network security. "Pattern recognition," Chen replied simply. "When you've seen enough different network configurations, certain vulnerabilities become apparent. It's probably something that could be fixed with a simple software update." Mitchell watched this exchange with growing resentment. Not only was Chen demonstrating expertise in areas outside her supposed specialty, but she was doing so in a way that made his own officers look incompetent. The fact that she was correct only made it more aggravating. By late afternoon, as they completed their tour of the facilities, Mitchell had developed a deep antipathy toward the Pentagon liaison who seemed determined to highlight problems and demonstrate superior knowledge at every turn. In his mind, Chen represented everything he disliked about the new generation of officers: politically savvy, technically proficient, but lacking the hard-earned wisdom that came from decades of service and genuine leadership experience. As they returned to his office, Mitchell decided to assert his authority more directly. "Colonel Chen, I hope your observations today have given you a realistic understanding of the challenges we face here at Fort Harrison. Running a base like this requires experience and judgment that can't be learned from textbooks or short-term deployments." Chen paused at the door of his office, turning to face him with an expression that remained professionally courteous despite the obvious condescension in his statement. "Thank you for the comprehensive tour, Colonel Mitchell. I've learned a great deal about the excellent work being done here. Your team is clearly dedicated and professional." Her response acknowledged his comment without directly challenging it, a diplomatic non-answer that neither agreed with his assessment nor provided an opening for further confrontation. It was the kind of political skill that Mitchell associated with career climbers who advanced through careful navigation of personalities rather than genuine leadership ability. "I'll be here for the remainder of the week," Chen continued. "I'm hoping to observe some of your training exercises and perhaps review your operational readiness reports, if that would be convenient." Mitchell nodded curtly. "Of course. Captain Rodriguez will coordinate with you on scheduling." He turned toward his desk, effectively dismissing her, but Chen's voice stopped him. "Colonel Mitchell, I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for what you've accomplished here. Building and maintaining a facility of this caliber requires exceptional leadership. I hope my presence won't be seen as intrusive, but rather as an opportunity for mutual learning." The statement was perfectly crafted to acknowledge his authority while subtly asserting her own legitimacy, delivered with just enough sincerity to make it difficult to reject without seeming churlish. Mitchell recognized the political skill involved, which only increased his irritation. "Of course, Colonel Chen. We're always happy to cooperate with Pentagon initiatives." After Chen left his office, Mitchell sat behind his desk, staring out the window at the base he had built into one of the most efficient installations in the military. For 4 years, he had run Fort Harrison with absolute authority, earning the respect of his subordinates and the admiration of his superiors through decisive leadership and unwavering standards. Now, for the first time in years, he felt his authority being subtly questioned by a junior officer who seemed determined to demonstrate her own expertise at every opportunity. The fact that Chen was technically competent only made the situation more frustrating. If she had been obviously incompetent, he could have dismissed her easily. Instead, she presented a challenge that required careful handling. Mitchell pulled out Chen's personnel file, which Captain Rodriguez had provided that morning. As he reviewed her record more carefully, he felt his irritation deepen. Graduated second in her class from West Point, multiple commendations for leadership and tactical innovation, advanced degrees in strategic studies and international relations, combat deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan with distinguished service records in each. On paper, Chen's qualifications were impressive, perhaps even superior to his own at the same stage of her career. However, Mitchell remained convinced that real military leadership couldn't be measured by academic achievements or even combat decorations. It required something intangible, the ability to command absolute loyalty and respect through force of personality and unwavering moral authority. As evening approached and the base settled into its nighttime routine, Mitchell remained in his office, planning his strategy for the remainder of Chen's visit. He was determined to demonstrate that regardless of her impressive credentials, she was still a junior officer in his domain, subject to his authority and dependent on his cooperation for the success of her mission. What he didn't yet realize was that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun was not just another Pentagon liaison officer gathering information for a routine report. Her presence at Fort Harrison was part of a much larger investigation, and her seemingly casual observations were building a comprehensive picture that would soon have consequences far beyond anything Colonel Mitchell could imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Mitchell believed about military hierarchy, personal authority, and the changing nature of leadership in the modern armed forces. His decision to view Chun as a threat to be managed rather than a colleague to be respected would prove to be the first in a series of miscalculations that would ultimately reveal just how much he had underestimated the quiet, competent officer who had walked into his domain that morning. The second day of Lieutenant Colonel Chen's visit began with an early morning training exercise that Colonel Mitchell had specifically arranged to showcase his leadership style. At 0530, as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern horizon, Mitchell stood on the observation platform overlooking the main training field, watching as his soldiers prepared for a complex tactical simulation he had designed personally. The exercise was one of his signatures, a multi-phase operation that tested everything from individual combat skills to unit coordination and strategic thinking. Mitchell had run variations of this exercise dozens of times, and it never failed to demonstrate the high level of readiness and discipline he had instilled in his command. Today, he intended it to show Colonel Chun the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical leadership. Chun arrived precisely at 0600, her uniform immaculate despite the early hour. She carried a thermos of coffee and a tactical tablet, greeting Mitchell with professional courtesy before taking her position on the observation platform. Her demeanor was alert and focused, the bearing of someone accustomed to early morning operations. This exercise simulates a hostage rescue scenario in an urban environment, Mitchell explained as soldiers took their positions on the training ground below. The objective is to neutralize the threat while minimizing civilian casualties and collateral damage. It requires precise coordination between multiple units and real-time tactical decision-making. Chen nodded, her attention focused on the soldiers preparing their equipment. What's the typical success rate for first-time participants? About 60% achieve the basic objectives, Mitchell replied with obvious pride. My units consistently score in the 95th percentile or higher. That's the difference between adequate training and superior leadership. The subtle emphasis on superior leadership was not lost on Chun, who simply nodded and continued observing the preparations. Mitchell felt a flicker of satisfaction at her lack of response. Perhaps she was finally beginning to understand the difference between Pentagon theories and field reality. As the exercise commenced, Mitchell provided running commentary, explaining the tactical decisions being made and highlighting the exceptional performance of his soldiers. His troops moved with precision and confidence, each unit executing their assigned roles with the seamless coordination that came from months of intensive training and shared experience. Bravo Team is now establishing overwatch positions, Mitchell narrated as soldiers moved into elevated positions around the simulated urban environment. Notice how they're maintaining visual contact with Charlie Team while covering potential escape routes. This kind of coordination doesn't happen by accident. Chun watched intently, occasionally making notes on her tablet, but offering little commentary. Mitchell interpreted her silence as impressed acknowledgement of his unit's capabilities. He continued his detailed explanation, pointing out subtle tactical innovations he had implemented and the superior performance metrics his command consistently achieved. 20 minutes into the exercise, Chen spoke for the first time since the operation began. Colonel Mitchell, I notice your teams are using standard breach protocols for the primary entry. Have you considered implementing the modified approach developed by the Special Operations Command? It might reduce exposure time by 15 to 20%. Mitchell paused mid-sentence, his jaw tightening slightly. The suggestion was delivered in a conversational tone, but it represented a direct critique of his tactical choices. Colonel Chun, these protocols have been tested extensively under real-world conditions. My soldiers know what works. Of course, Chun replied diplomatically. I was just curious whether you'd evaluated the newer techniques. They've shown promising results in recent operations. The implication that his methods might be outdated stung more than Mitchell cared to admit. He had developed his tactical approaches through years of combat experience and successful operations. The suggestion that some Pentagon study group might have improved upon his proven methods represented exactly the kind of academic arrogance he despised. Experience, Colonel Chun, is worth more than theoretical improvements developed by officers who've never had to make life-or-death decisions under fire, Mitchell replied, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby officers glance in their direction. Chen's expression remained neutral, but her next words cut through Mitchell's defensive posture with surgical precision. I understand that perspective, Colonel. During my deployment in Kandahar, we initially resisted similar modifications to our breach protocols. However, after losing 2 soldiers to improved IED placement tactics, we found that adaptation was essential for maintaining operational effectiveness. The casual reference to losing soldiers under her command hit Mitchell like a physical blow. Combat leaders who had experienced casualties carried that weight differently than those who had been fortunate enough to avoid such losses. Chen's matter-of-fact delivery suggested someone who had processed that grief and integrated those lessons into her professional development without allowing it to define her entirely. Mitchell found himself momentarily speechless, his prepared criticisms about inexperience suddenly inappropriate and ineffective. The mention of Kandahar, one of the most challenging theaters in Afghanistan, indicated that Chun had commanded troops in genuine combat situations rather than simply serving in support roles. Before he could formulate a response, the exercise below took an unexpected turn. Alpha Team, responsible for the primary assault, encountered a simulated equipment failure that required rapid tactical adjustment. Mitchell watched with professional interest as his team leaders adapted to the changing situation, their training taking over as they implemented contingency protocols. Excellent response, Chen observed quietly. Your team leaders show real initiative in crisis adaptation. That's not something that can be taught easily. The compliment was genuine and professional, focusing on the soldiers' performance rather than Mitchell's leadership, but it reminded him that Chun was evaluating everything she observed. Her assessment would become part of whatever report she submitted to her Pentagon superiors, potentially affecting his career prospects and the future of his command. As the exercise concluded with his team successfully completing their objectives despite the simulated equipment failure, Mitchell felt a familiar surge of pride in his soldiers' performance. They had executed flawlessly under pressure, demonstrating the high level of training and leadership that had made Fort Harrison one of the most respected installations in the military. Impressive execution, Chun said as the soldiers began their post-exercise procedures. Your training program clearly emphasizes adaptability under pressure. That's a critical skill set that many units struggle to develop. Mitchell accepted the compliment with a curt nod, though he remained suspicious of Chen's motivations. Her observations were consistently professional and apparently genuine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was gathering information for purposes beyond simple liaison duties. After the exercise debriefing, Chen requested permission to interview some of the participating soldiers individually. Mitchell reluctantly agreed, though he insisted that Captain Rodriguez remain present during the interviews to ensure that his soldiers weren't subjected to inappropriate questioning. The first interview was with Sergeant First Class Jackson, a veteran non-commissioned officer who had served under Mitchell for 3 years. Jackson was one of Mitchell's most reliable squad leaders, someone who embodied the discipline and loyalty that characterized the best soldiers under his command. Sergeant Jackson, Chen began, I'm interested in your perspective on the training programs here at Fort Harrison. How do they compare to your experiences at other installations? Jackson straightened in his chair, clearly aware that his response might reflect on his commanding officer. Ma'am, Colonel Mitchell runs the tightest, most professional operation I've seen in 15 years of service. His standards are high, but they make us better soldiers. What specific aspects of the training do you find most valuable? Chun continued, her tone conversational rather than interrogatory. The emphasis on team coordination, ma'am. Colonel Mitchell insists that we train together until we can anticipate each other's actions. It's made our unit more effective than anything I've experienced before. Chin made notes on her tablet, then asked, Have you had opportunities to suggest modifications or improvements to training procedures? Jackson hesitated slightly, glancing briefly at Captain Rodriguez before responding. Colonel Mitchell welcomes input from experienced soldiers, ma'am. He listens to suggestions about tactical implementation. The slight hesitation and the carefully worded response suggested to Chun that while Mitchell might technically welcome input, the command structure discouraged junior personnel from offering unsolicited suggestions. It was a common pattern in organizations where strong leadership had calcified into rigid authoritarianism. The second interview was with Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a young officer who had graduated from the officer candidate school 18 months earlier. Martinez was clearly nervous about being interviewed by a lieutenant colonel from the Pentagon. Her responses carefully measured and formal. Lieutenant Martinez, how has your experience here contributed to your professional development? Chen asked. Colonel Mitchell has provided excellent mentorship, ma'am. He's taught me the importance of maintaining high standards and leading by example. What challenges have you faced in your role here? Martinez glanced toward Captain Rodriguez before answering. Learning to balance administrative requirements with operational readiness, ma'am. Colonel Mitchell emphasizes that bureaucratic procedures should never compromise mission effectiveness. Chen noted the subtle criticism of administrative oversight embedded in Martinez's response. It suggested that Mitchell regularly expressed frustration with external requirements and had instilled that attitude in his subordinate officers. Have you had opportunities to implement your own ideas or take initiative in your assigned responsibilities? Yes, ma'am. Colonel Mitchell delegates authority appropriately and holds us accountable for results. Again, the response was technically positive, but suggested a command structure that emphasized delegation within narrow parameters rather than encouraging creative problem-solving or independent thinking. After completing several more interviews, Chun thanked the soldiers for their time and dismissed them. Captain Rodriguez escorted her back to Mitchell's office, where the colonel was reviewing personnel files and preparing for an afternoon meeting with his department heads. How did your interviews go, Colonel Chen? Mitchell asked, looking up from his paperwork with an expression of polite interest that didn't quite mask his underlying concern about what his soldiers might have revealed. Very informative, Chen replied diplomatically. Your soldiers clearly respect your leadership and take pride in their performance. That speaks well of your command style. Mitchell felt a surge of satisfaction at the apparent endorsement of his leadership approach. Despite Chen's earlier criticisms and suggestions, she seemed to recognize the quality of his operation and the loyalty he had earned from his subordinates. I found that soldiers respond best to clear expectations and consistent standards, Mitchell said, settling back in his chair with obvious confidence. Too many modern officers try to be friends with their troops instead of leaders. That approach might be popular, but it doesn't win battles. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Leadership styles certainly vary depending on circumstances and personalities. I've found that the most effective leaders adapt their approach to the specific needs of their mission and personnel. The subtle implication that effective leadership required flexibility rather than rigid consistency was delivered so diplomatically that it would have been difficult for Mitchell to take offense, yet it represented another gentle challenge to his fundamental assumptions about command authority. Adaptation is fine for tactics, Colonel Chun, but leadership principles are universal. Discipline, loyalty, and respect for authority form the foundation of military effectiveness. Start compromising on those fundamentals, and you end up with chaos. Those are certainly important principles, Chen agreed. I suppose the question is how to maintain them while also encouraging innovation and independent thinking. Modern warfare often requires rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Mitchell felt his frustration rising again. Chen seemed determined to couch every agreement with subtle qualifications that undermined the validity of his positions. It was the kind of intellectual gamesmanship he associated with academic officers who had learned to debate theories rather than make practical decisions under pressure. Colonel Chen, with respect, innovation, and independent thinking are luxuries that we can afford only after we've mastered the fundamentals. My soldiers know their jobs because they've been trained to standards of excellence that don't change based on current trends or theoretical improvements. Chen's response was interrupted by a knock on Mitchell's door. Captain Rodriguez entered with a priority message that had just arrived from division headquarters. Mitchell read the message quickly, his expression darkening as he processed the contents. Problem, Colonel? Chen asked, noting his obvious displeasure. Nothing that affects your visit, Mitchell replied curtly, though his tone suggested otherwise. Division is implementing new reporting requirements that will add another layer of bureaucratic overhead to our operational procedures. Chen waited for him to elaborate, but Mitchell simply filed the message and turned his attention back to their conversation. However, the interruption had clearly affected his mood, and his responses became noticeably more defensive and combative. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Colonel Chen. Every month brings new requirements from officers who've never commanded troops in the field. They sit in comfortable offices creating procedures that sound good on paper, but interfere with actual military operations. Change can certainly be challenging to implement, Chen acknowledged. What specific aspects of the new requirements do you find most problematic? Mitchell launched into a detailed critique of the new reporting procedures, his frustration evident in every word. The requirements mandated additional documentation of training effectiveness, personnel welfare programs, and equipment maintenance schedules. While ostensibly designed to improve readiness and accountability, Mitchell saw them as unnecessary interference with his proven management systems. These reports won't make my soldiers any more effective, Mitchell concluded. They'll just take time away from training and operations to satisfy some Pentagon analyst who's never worn combat boots. Chen listened carefully to his concerns, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding his perspective. However, her questions also revealed a thorough knowledge of the policy rationale behind the new requirements, suggesting that she might have been involved in their development. I understand your concerns about administrative burden, Chen said finally. However, standardized reporting can provide valuable data for resource allocation and strategic planning. The challenge is implementing these requirements in ways that minimize operational impact while maximizing useful information. Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you familiar with these specific requirements, Colonel Chen? I've seen similar initiatives, Chen replied carefully. The Pentagon is always looking for ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness across all installations. The evasive nature of her response confirmed Mitchell's suspicion that Chen was more involved with these policies than she had initially indicated. Her presence at Fort Harrison might be directly related to evaluating the implementation of requirements she had helped develop, which would explain her detailed questions about his operational procedures. Colonel Chen, Mitchell said, his voice taking on a harder edge. I hope you'll remember that policies that look reasonable in Washington don't always translate well to field conditions. Real military leadership requires the flexibility to adapt procedures to local circumstances. Of course, Chen replied evenly. That's why liaison visits like this are so valuable. They help ensure that policy development is informed by field experience and practical considerations. The diplomatic response acknowledged his concerns while subtly reaffirming the legitimacy of Pentagon oversight, exactly the kind of bureaucratic double-talk that Mitchell despised. He was becoming increasingly convinced that Chen represented everything wrong with the modern military bureaucracy: intelligent, educated, politically skilled, but fundamentally disconnected from the realities of combat leadership. As the afternoon progressed, Mitchell found himself scrutinizing Chen's every comment and question for hidden agendas and political motivations. Her professional competence, which had initially surprised him, now seemed like a calculated performance designed to gather intelligence while maintaining the pretense of collegial cooperation. The final straw came during a tour of the base's medical facilities, when Chen engaged in a detailed discussion with the chief medical officer about psychological support services for returning veterans. Her questions revealed extensive knowledge of current research on combat stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, areas that Mitchell considered outside the scope of a strategic planning officer's expertise. Colonel Chen, Mitchell interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. I'm curious about your background in medical and psychological services. That's quite specialized knowledge for a Pentagon liaison officer. Chen paused in her conversation with the medical officer, turning to face Mitchell with an expression that remained professionally neutral despite the obvious challenge in his question. I've had occasion to work with medical personnel in various capacities, Colonel Mitchell. Understanding soldier welfare is an important aspect of strategic planning. The response was technically accurate but clearly evasive, confirming Mitchell's suspicion that Chen was not simply a liaison officer gathering general information. Her expertise spanned too many areas, and her questions were too focused for someone conducting a routine assessment. Of course, Mitchell replied, his tone making it clear that he wasn't satisfied with her explanation. I suppose Pentagon officers are expected to be knowledgeable about many different areas of military operations. Chen met his gaze directly, her expression calm, but alert. For the first time since her arrival, Mitchell sensed that she was evaluating him as carefully as he had been evaluating her, and that whatever conclusions she reached might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. The remainder of the day passed with increasing tension between them, their interactions maintaining the facade of professional cooperation while both officers maneuvered for advantage in a game whose rules and objectives remained unclear. Mitchell was determined to assert his authority and expose Chen's true agenda, while Chun continued gathering information with methodical thoroughness that suggested she was building toward some specific conclusion. As evening approached and the base settled into its nighttime routine, Mitchell remained convinced that he was dealing with a junior officer who had exceeded her authority and overestimated her own importance. What he still didn't realize was that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun was playing a much more complex game than he understood, and that his attempts to intimidate and marginalize her were being carefully documented as evidence of exactly the kind of leadership problems she had been sent to investigate. The third day of Colonel Chen's visit dawned gray and overcast, with threatening clouds that matched the increasingly tense atmosphere surrounding her presence at Fort Harrison. Colonel Mitchell arrived at his office earlier than usual, having spent a restless night reviewing personnel files and trying to determine exactly what Chen was looking for during her seemingly comprehensive evaluation of his command. At 0700, Captain Rodriguez knocked on Mitchell's door with the morning briefing materials and an unusual request. "Sir, Colonel Chun has asked permission to observe our court-martial proceedings this morning. Staff Sergeant Williams is being tried for insubordination and conduct unbecoming." Mitchell looked up from his morning reports, his expression darkening. The Williams case was a straightforward disciplinary matter involving a non-commissioned officer who had repeatedly challenged direct orders and had finally crossed the line into outright defiance during a training exercise. Mitchell had personally preferred charges, considering it a clear-cut case that would reinforce proper discipline and chain of command throughout his units. "Did she specify why she wants to observe military justice proceedings?" Mitchell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Chun was systematically examining every aspect of his command, and the administration of military justice was certainly within the scope of strategic planning oversight. "No specific reason, sir. She simply requested permission as part of her comprehensive assessment of base operations." Mitchell considered denying the request, but he realized that would only make him appear defensive and might raise questions about his confidence in the proceedings. The Williams case was solid, backed by multiple witnesses and clear violations of military regulations. If anything, observing the court-martial might demonstrate his firm commitment to maintaining discipline and standards. Grant her request, Mitchell decided. She can observe from the designated seating area, but make it clear that these proceedings are confidential and not subject to discussion during her visit. The court-martial convened at 0900 in the base legal office, a sterile conference room that had been converted into a temporary courtroom for the proceedings. Mitchell took his seat as the convening authority, while Chun positioned herself in the observer's section with her ever-present tablet and professional demeanor. Staff Sergeant David Williams stood at attention as the charges were read. He was a 15-year veteran with an otherwise exemplary service record, but recent months had seen a pattern of increasingly defiant behavior that culminated in his public refusal to implement a training modification Mitchell had personally ordered. The prosecution, led by Captain Jennifer Hayes from the base legal office, presented a straightforward case built on witness testimony and documented evidence of Williams's insubordination. The incidents began 6 months earlier when Williams had questioned new equipment maintenance procedures during a staff meeting, escalated through several instances of delayed compliance with direct orders, and reached its climax when he openly refused to implement Mitchell's tactical modifications during a live training exercise. Staff Sergeant Williams, Captain Hayes stated during her opening argument, has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that undermines military discipline and chain of command. His actions represent not just personal insubordination, but a threat to the unit cohesion and operational effectiveness that are essential to military success. Williams's defense attorney, Lieutenant Mark Chun, no relation to the observing colonel, presented a different narrative. He acknowledged that his client had disagreed with certain orders and procedures, but argued that Williams's concerns were based on legitimate professional judgment about soldier safety and mission effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Williams is a decorated combat veteran with 15 years of exemplary service, Lieutenant Chin argued. His concerns about training procedures were based on extensive experience and genuine worry about soldier welfare. While his expression of these concerns may have been inappropriate, his motivations were professional rather than personal. Mitchell listened to the defense arguments with growing irritation. Williams had clearly violated the chain of command and undermined his authority, regardless of whatever rationalization the defense attorney might construct. Military discipline required absolute obedience to lawful orders, and allowing subordinates to pick and choose which commands to follow based on their personal judgment would destroy the entire system of military authority. As the trial proceeded, witness after witness confirmed the basic facts of Williams's behavior. However, the testimony also revealed details that painted a more complex picture than Mitchell had anticipated. Several soldiers testified that Williams had privately expressed concerns about safety issues related to the modified training procedures, and that he had initially attempted to raise these concerns through proper channels before his behavior became openly defiant. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, one of Mitchell's most reliable non-commissioned officers, testified reluctantly about conversations in which Williams had described specific safety hazards he believed were created by the new training modifications. Rodriguez acknowledged that Williams had initially followed proper procedures for raising concerns, but had become increasingly frustrated when his input was dismissed without serious consideration. Did Staff Sergeant Williams explain why he believed the modifications were dangerous? Lieutenant Chin asked during cross-examination. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, clearly reluctant to criticize his commanding officer's decisions. He said the new timing requirements didn't allow for proper equipment checks, sir. He was worried that soldiers might skip safety procedures to meet the time standards. Did Staff Sergeant Williams suggest alternative approaches that might address these concerns? Yes, sir. He proposed modifying the timing standards to include safety check time, or implementing equipment pre-checks to ensure that safety wouldn't be compromised. Mitchell felt his jaw tighten as he listened to this testimony. Williams had indeed raised these concerns, but Mitchell had dismissed them as resistance to change rather than legitimate safety issues. The modified training procedures were designed to improve efficiency and better simulate combat conditions where soldiers might not have time for lengthy safety checks. Colonel Chun observed these proceedings with the intense focus she had brought to every aspect of her visit, taking detailed notes and occasionally making what appeared to be priority annotations on her tablet. Mitchell noticed that she paid particular attention to testimony about the command climate and the processes for addressing soldier concerns. The most damaging testimony came from Private First Class Morrison, a young soldier who had been injured during one of the training exercises conducted under the modified procedures. Morrison testified that he had observed other soldiers skipping safety checks to meet the new timing requirements, and that his own injury might have been prevented if proper equipment inspection procedures had been followed. Private Morrison, Lieutenant Chun asked gently, "Did you or any other soldiers attempt to raise these safety concerns with your chain of command?" "Yes, sir. We mentioned it to Staff Sergeant Williams, and he said he would handle it." "Did Staff Sergeant Williams follow up with you about the results of raising these concerns?" Morrison hesitated, glancing toward Colonel Mitchell before answering. "He said he had tried to address it, sir, but that the timing requirements were non-negotiable." The implication that Mitchell had prioritized arbitrary training standards over soldier safety hung in the courtroom like an accusation, despite the careful way it had been elicited through testimony. Mitchell realized that what he had viewed as a simple case of insubordination was being reframed as a conscientious soldier's attempt to protect his troops from unreasonable risks. During a brief recess, Mitchell approached Captain Hayes to discuss the unexpected turn in the testimony. "Captain, I want to make sure the court understands that these training modifications were based on proven tactical principles and designed to improve combat readiness." "Of course, sir," Hayes replied, though her expression suggested she was reconsidering her assessment of the case's strength. However, the defense is building an argument that Staff Sergeant Williams's concerns were legitimate and that his methods, while inappropriate, were motivated by genuine professional judgment rather than simple defiance. Mitchell glanced toward Colonel Chun, who was reviewing her notes with the methodical attention she brought to everything. He had wanted her to observe military justice in action as an example of his firm leadership and commitment to discipline. Instead, she was witnessing testimony that suggested he had ignored legitimate safety concerns and retaliated against a soldier who had tried to protect his troops. When proceedings resumed, the defense called Staff Sergeant Williams to testify on his own behalf. Williams took the stand with military bearing, acknowledging his actions while explaining the reasoning behind his concerns and his growing frustration with what he perceived as an unwillingness to consider alternative approaches that might address safety issues. Staff Sergeant Williams, his defense attorney asked, "Can you explain your decision to refuse the direct order during the training exercise on March 15th? Williams straightened in his chair, his voice clear and steady. "Sir, I had observed multiple safety violations during previous exercises using the modified procedures. I believe that continuing to implement these procedures without addressing the safety issues would put my soldiers at unnecessary risk. Did you consider alternative ways to address your concerns?" "Yes, sir. I had attempted to raise these issues through proper channels multiple times over the previous 3 months. When those efforts were unsuccessful, I felt that I had no choice but to refuse to implement procedures I believed were dangerous." "Do you understand that refusing a direct order violates military regulations, regardless of your motivations?" "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions. However, I believe that my primary obligation was to protect the soldiers under my supervision, even if that meant facing disciplinary action." Mitchell watched this testimony with mounting anger. Williams was essentially claiming that his insubordination was justified by superior moral authority, exactly the kind of reasoning that could destroy military discipline if allowed to go unchallenged. The fact that Williams delivered his testimony with obvious sincerity and military bearing only made it more dangerous. Colonel Chun continued taking notes throughout Williams's testimony, her expression remaining neutral, but her attention clearly focused on the command climate issues being revealed through the proceedings. Mitchell realized that regardless of the court-martial's outcome, Chun was gathering information about his leadership style and decision-making processes that might not reflect favorably on his command. The prosecution's rebuttal attempted to refocus attention on the fundamental issue of military discipline and chain of command. Captain Hayes argued that regardless of Williams's motivations, allowing subordinates to disobey orders based on their personal judgment would make military operations impossible. "Military discipline exists for a reason," Hayes argued in her closing statement. "Soldiers cannot be permitted to pick and choose which orders to follow based on their individual assessment of those orders' wisdom or safety." Staff Sergeant Williams's concerns, however well-intentioned, do not justify his violation of direct orders and his undermining of command authority. The defense closing argument acknowledged the importance of military discipline, while arguing that Williams's actions represented the kind of moral courage that the military should encourage rather than punish. Lieutenant Chun concluded by noting that Williams had attempted to work within the system before resorting to direct defiance, and that his concerns had proven to be legitimate based on subsequent safety incidents. The court deliberated for 2 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on the insubordination charge, but with a recommendation for minimal punishment based on Williams's exemplary service record and the legitimate nature of his underlying concerns. The panel recommended a formal reprimand and reduction in rank, far less severe than the punishment Mitchell had expected and requested. As the proceedings concluded, Mitchell felt a mixture of vindication and frustration. Williams had been found guilty of insubordination, confirming that proper military discipline had been maintained. However, the light sentence and the panel's comments about legitimate concerns suggested that they had been influenced by the defense arguments about command climate and leadership responsiveness. Colonel Chun gathered her materials and prepared to leave the courtroom without comment, but Mitchell intercepted her near the exit. "Colonel Chun, I hope you found the proceedings informative about our commitment to maintaining proper discipline and military justice." Chun paused, considering her response carefully. "It was certainly educational, Colonel Mitchell. Military justice proceedings often reveal important information about command climate and leadership effectiveness." The diplomatic response acknowledged his comment, while subtly suggesting that the proceedings had revealed more about his command than he might have intended. Mitchell felt a familiar surge of irritation at Chin's ability to respond to direct statements with qualified observations that undermined their intended meaning. "I trust you understand that maintaining discipline sometimes requires difficult decisions," Mitchell continued. Staff Sergeant Williams's concerns might have been well-intentioned, but military effectiveness depends on soldiers following orders rather than second-guessing their superiors. "Leadership certainly involves balancing multiple considerations," Chin replied evenly. The challenge is creating command climates where legitimate concerns can be addressed through proper channels while maintaining necessary discipline and authority. Again, Chen had managed to acknowledge his point while suggesting that the real issue might be his failure to create appropriate channels for addressing soldier concerns. Mitchell was beginning to recognize that every conversation with Chen became a subtle battle over fundamental assumptions about leadership and military management. That afternoon, Chen requested meetings with several more soldiers and officers, including some who had been involved in the incidents leading to Staff Sergeant Williams's court-martial. Mitchell reluctantly granted these requests, though he insisted that Captain Rodriguez continue monitoring the interviews to ensure appropriate conduct. The first interview was with Sergeant Rodriguez, who had testified during the morning's proceedings. Chen's questions focused on the command climate and the processes for soldiers to raise concerns or suggest improvements to training and operational procedures. Sergeant Rodriguez, Chen began. In your experience here at Fort Harrison, how responsive is the command structure to input from non-commissioned officers and enlisted personnel? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that his response might be interpreted as criticism of his commanding officer. Ma'am, Colonel Mitchell maintains high standards and expects professional performance from all personnel. Of course, I'm specifically interested in situations where soldiers identify potential problems or suggest improvements to existing procedures. How are those concerns typically addressed? The colonel encourages feedback through proper channels, ma'am. However, he also expects soldiers to trust in the experience and judgment of their superiors. Chen made notes on her tablet, then asked, "Can you describe a specific instance where you or your soldiers raised concerns about training or operational procedures?" Rodriguez hesitated, glancing toward Captain Rodriguez before responding. "There have been occasional discussions about training modifications, ma'am." The colonel considers all input, but final decisions rest with command authority. The careful phrasing of Rodriguez's responses suggested to Chen that while Mitchell might technically welcome input, the practical reality was that subordinate concerns were often dismissed or ignored. It was a pattern she had observed in other commands where strong leadership had evolved into rigid authoritarianism. Subsequent interviews with other personnel revealed similar patterns. Soldiers expressed genuine respect for Mitchell's competence and dedication, but also described a command climate where questioning decisions or suggesting alternatives was discouraged and sometimes interpreted as disrespectful or disloyal. Private Morrison, the soldier who had been injured during the modified training exercise, provided the most revealing testimony. He described a unit culture where soldiers were expected to adapt and overcome without complaint, even when they observed safety issues or operational problems. Private Morrison, Chen asked, "When you were injured during the training exercise, did you feel comfortable reporting the circumstances that led to your injury?" Morrison looked uncomfortable, his loyalty to his unit clearly conflicting with his desire to answer honestly. "Ma'am, accidents happen during training. It's part of the job. I understand that. However, I'm interested in whether you felt that the injury could have been prevented if different procedures had been followed." "It's possible, ma'am. But second-guessing training procedures isn't really our job. We're supposed to execute the mission as ordered." The response revealed exactly the kind of blind obedience that Chen had begun to suspect characterized Mitchell's command philosophy. While such loyalty could be valuable in combat situations, it could also prevent the kind of adaptive learning that modern military operations required. As the interviews concluded, Chen began organizing her observations into a comprehensive assessment that painted a disturbing picture of Mitchell's leadership style. His emphasis on discipline and loyalty had created a command climate that discouraged initiative, suppressed dissent, and prioritized compliance over effectiveness. The court-martial proceedings had provided a perfect illustration of these problems. Williams's concerns about safety had been legitimate, as evidenced by subsequent injuries and the testimony of multiple soldiers. However, Mitchell's rigid approach to command authority had prevented these concerns from being addressed through proper channels, ultimately forcing a dedicated soldier to choose between following orders and protecting his troops. That evening, as Chen compiled her daily reports in her temporary quarters, she reflected on the complex dynamics she had observed during her 3 days at Fort Harrison. Mitchell was clearly a competent officer with genuine military experience and dedication to his mission. However, his leadership style represented an outdated approach that emphasized control over collaboration and compliance over innovation. The modern military required leaders who could maintain discipline while encouraging adaptability, who could command respect while remaining open to input from subordinates, and who could balance authority with accountability. Mitchell's approach might have been effective in earlier eras, but it was increasingly problematic in contemporary military operations that required rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Chen's assessment was nearly complete, and her recommendations would soon be forwarded to Pentagon leadership for review and action. However, she still had 2 more days at Fort Harrison, and she suspected that Mitchell's growing awareness of her true mission might lead to more direct confrontation before her visit concluded. What neither Chen nor Mitchell realized was that events beyond their control were about to intervene in their professional chess match. A priority message was already en route to Fort Harrison that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their relationship and force both officers to confront assumptions they had never questioned. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge everything Mitchell believed about military hierarchy, personal authority, and the true identity of the quiet, competent officer who had been systematically dismantling his assumptions about leadership and command. The 4th day of Lieutenant Colonel Chen's visit began with an atmosphere of barely concealed hostility that had been building since her arrival at Fort Harrison. Colonel Mitchell arrived at his office with the grim determination of a man who had spent the night planning his strategy for dealing with what he now viewed as a direct threat to his authority and the integrity of his command. Chen's systematic questioning of his procedures, her obvious familiarity with Pentagon policies he opposed, and her apparent sympathy for Staff Sergeant Williams's insubordination had convinced Mitchell that she was conducting some form of investigation rather than a routine liaison visit. He was determined to reassert his authority and force her to acknowledge the boundaries of her role as a junior officer in his domain. At 0800, Captain Rodriguez delivered the morning briefing with an unusual addition, a priority message from Division Headquarters requesting immediate clarification about certain personnel matters and operational procedures. Mitchell read the message with growing unease, recognizing that it contained specific questions that closely paralleled the areas Chun had been investigating. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "the division commander wants responses to these inquiries by close of business today. Some of them require detailed explanations about command climate and personnel management procedures." Mitchell's jaw tightened as he realized that Chen's visit and the division inquiry were almost certainly connected. Whatever report she was preparing had already begun generating questions from his superiors, potentially threatening the positive reputation he had built through 4 years of successful command. "Schedule a meeting with Colonel Chun for 0900, Mitchell ordered, his voice carrying a hard edge that made Rodriguez straighten unconsciously. "I want to clarify the scope and purpose of her visit before this situation gets out of hand." At exactly 9 o'clock, Chun knocked on Mitchell's office door with her customary punctuality. She entered carrying her leather portfolio and tablet, her demeanor professional but alert to the obvious tension in Mitchell's posture and expression. "Colonel Chun," Mitchell began without preamble, "I've received some questions from Division Headquarters that suggest your visit here involves more than routine liaison duties. I think it's time for you to explain exactly what you're doing at my base." Chin settled into the chair across from Mitchell's desk, her expression remaining neutral despite the obvious confrontation in his tone. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm conducting a comprehensive assessment of operations here at Fort Harrison as part of my Pentagon liaison responsibilities. I believe I've been quite transparent about that from the beginning." "Transparent?" Mitchell's voice rose slightly, his frustration finally breaking through his professional restraint. "You've been interrogating my soldiers, questioning my procedures, and apparently reporting your observations to Division Command. That doesn't sound like liaison work to me." Chin met his gaze directly, her voice remaining calm and steady. "Colonel Mitchell, all of my activities have been conducted with your knowledge and permission. I've observed standard military operations, interviewed personnel through proper channels, and maintained appropriate communication with my superiors. If you have specific concerns about my conduct, I'm happy to address them." The diplomatic response only increased Mitchell's irritation. Chun continued to deflect his accusations while acknowledging just enough truth to make direct confrontation difficult. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering he despised, and it confirmed his suspicion that she was more interested in protecting her own position than honestly addressing his concerns. "Colonel Chun," Mitchell said, leaning forward across his desk, "let me be direct. I've been commanding troops for over 20 years, and I've seen every kind of Pentagon bureaucrat who thinks they know better than field commanders. You're here to find problems with my operation, and you're twisting normal military activities into evidence of leadership failures. Chin's expression remained professionally neutral, but Mitchell noticed a subtle change in her posture that suggested he had finally provoked a genuine response. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that he hadn't heard before. Colonel Mitchell, I understand that external oversight can feel threatening, especially when you've built a successful operation. However, my role is to ensure that all installations are meeting current standards for operational effectiveness and personnel management. If my observations have identified areas for improvement, that's information the military needs to address. Areas for improvement? Mitchell's voice carried a note of outraged disbelief. My base has consistently received superior ratings in every category. My soldiers are among the best trained in the military. My operational readiness scores are in the top 5% of all installations. What exactly do you think needs improvement? Shin opened her portfolio and withdrew a tablet, consulting her notes before responding. Colonel Mitchell, your unit's technical proficiency and operational capabilities are indeed impressive. However, effective leadership involves more than just achieving mission objectives. It also requires creating command climates that encourage professional development, innovation, and open communication. Open communication? Mitchell stood up abruptly, his patience finally exhausted. Colonel Chun, this is the military, not a civilian corporation. We don't make decisions by committee or encourage subordinates to second-guess their superiors. We follow orders and maintain discipline because that's what wins battles and keeps soldiers alive. Chen remained seated, her voice staying calm despite Mitchell's obvious agitation. No one is questioning the importance of military discipline, Colonel. However, the most effective units find ways to maintain authority while also encouraging input from experienced personnel. Staff Sergeant Williams's court-martial yesterday illustrated exactly the kind of problem that can occur when legitimate concerns can't be addressed through proper channels. The mention of Williams's court-martial was the final straw for Mitchell. Chun was using a routine disciplinary action as evidence of leadership failure, exactly the kind of second-guessing he had expected from a Pentagon bureaucrat who had never faced the real challenges of command. That's enough, Mitchell said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority. Colonel Chun, you're a lieutenant colonel talking to a full colonel about leadership and military discipline. Williams was court-martialed because he refused to follow orders, not because I failed to listen to his concerns. If you think you can come into my command and criticize decisions made by officers with more experience and higher rank, you're seriously mistaken about your role here. The room fell silent as Mitchell's words hung in the air between them. He had finally said what he had been thinking since Chen's arrival. She was a junior officer who had overstepped her bounds and needed to be reminded of her place in the military hierarchy. The authority in his voice and the direct challenge to her competence represented a line he had been building toward crossing since their first meeting. Chen looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried an undertone that made Mitchell suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of his direct confrontation. Colonel Mitchell, she said slowly, I think there may be some confusion about the nature of my assignment here and the authority under which I'm operating. Something in her tone made Mitchell pause, a subtle shift that suggested he might have miscalculated something important about their relationship. However, his anger and frustration were too strong to allow him to back down from the position he had taken. There's no confusion, Colonel Chun. You're a lieutenant colonel on temporary assignment from the Pentagon. I'm the base commander with 4 years of successful leadership at this installation. If you have concerns about my command, you can include them in whatever report you're writing, but don't expect me to stand here and listen to lectures about leadership from someone who's never commanded anything larger than a Pentagon planning committee. Chin stood up slowly, closing her portfolio and adjusting her uniform with deliberate precision. When she looked at Mitchell again, her expression had changed subtly, carrying an authority that hadn't been present before. Colonel Mitchell, she said, her voice now carrying unmistakable command presence. I think it's time to clarify exactly who I am and why I'm here. Mitchell felt a flicker of unease at the change in her demeanor, but his commitment to the confrontation he had initiated prevented him from backing down. I know exactly who you are, Colonel Chin. You're a Pentagon staff officer conducting some kind of investigation disguised as a liaison visit. Chin reached into her portfolio and withdrew an official document, placing it on Mitchell's desk with ceremonial precision. Colonel Mitchell, my name is Sarah Chun, and my current rank is Brigadier General, United States Army. I've been serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness for the past 18 months. Mitchell stared at the document in front of him, his mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything he had assumed about Chin's identity and authority. The official letterhead was unmistakable: Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary of Defense. Chin's photograph was attached to credentials that clearly identified her as a one-star general with authority over personnel and readiness policies across all branches of the military. "That's impossible," Mitchell said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're wearing Lieutenant Colonel insignia. Your introduction identified you as Lieutenant Colonel Chun from Pentagon Strategic Planning." Chin's expression remained neutral, but there was no mistaking the authority in her voice as she explained. The identification was accurate for operational security purposes. When conducting field assessments, I often use my previous rank and a cover assignment to ensure that installations respond naturally rather than preparing special presentations for senior leadership. Mitchell sank back into his chair, his mind racing as he tried to understand the implications of what he was hearing. If Chun was actually a brigadier general serving in a senior Pentagon position, then everything about their relationship and his treatment of her over the past 4 days had been catastrophically inappropriate. "The new reporting requirements you've been complaining about," Chun continued, her voice taking on an edge of steel, "were developed by my office based on field assessments like this one. The policies you've been criticizing were designed to address exactly the kind of command climate problems I've observed here at Fort Harrison." The room seemed to spin around Mitchell as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. He had not been dealing with a junior officer conducting a routine liaison visit. He had been openly challenging and insulting a general officer who had direct responsibility for the policies he opposed, and the authority to end his career with a single phone call. "General Chun," Mitchell began, his voice now carrying the respect and formality that her rank demanded, "I had no idea about your actual position or authority." "If I had known." Chun raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Colonel Mitchell, the entire purpose of conducting assessments under operational cover is to observe normal command behavior rather than carefully prepared presentations. Your treatment of someone you believe to be a junior officer has been far more revealing than any formal inspection could have been." Mitchell felt his career collapsing around him as he realized that every contemptuous comment, every dismissive gesture, and every challenge to Chin's authority had been directed at a general officer who now had comprehensive documentation of his behavior and leadership style. "Over the past 4 days," Chin continued, consulting her tablet, "I've observed a command climate characterized by rigid authoritarianism, resistance to policy guidance from higher headquarters, and systematic suppression of subordinate input. Your treatment of Staff Sergeant Williams represents exactly the kind of leadership failure that my office was established to identify and address." The clinical precision with which Chun delivered her assessment made it clear that she had been building a comprehensive case against his leadership from the moment she arrived. Her questions about his procedures, her interviews with his soldiers, and her observation of the court-martial had all been part of a systematic evaluation that would now become the foundation for official action against him. "General Chun," Mitchell said, struggling to maintain some semblance of professional dignity, "I request the opportunity to provide my perspective on the issues you've identified. My leadership style may be different from current trends, but it has produced consistently superior results." Chin's expression remained impassive as she responded, "Colonel Mitchell, you will certainly have opportunities to present your perspective through appropriate channels. However, based on my observations and the documentation I've compiled, I will be recommending immediate relief from command and a comprehensive review of your leadership practices." The words hit Mitchell like physical blows. Relief from command would effectively end his military career, destroying everything he had built through 3 decades of service. The comprehensive review Chin mentioned would examine every aspect of his leadership and likely result in formal censure or worse. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, using the formal address appropriate for a senior officer, "I understand that my behavior toward you has been inappropriate. However, I believe the issues you've identified stem from misunderstandings rather than fundamental leadership failures." Chun gathered her materials and prepared to leave, her movements carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the careers and lives of thousands of personnel. When she spoke, her voice was final and unmistakable. "Colonel Mitchell, effective leadership requires the ability to treat all personnel with appropriate respect regardless of their rank or position. Your assumption that you could intimidate and dismiss someone you believe to be junior to you reveals exactly the kind of character flaw that makes you unsuitable for command. As Chun reached the door, she paused and turned back to face Mitchell one final time. The military is changing, Colonel. The kind of authoritarian leadership you represent belongs to an earlier era. Modern military operations require leaders who can inspire rather than intimidate, who can adapt rather than resist change, and who can treat every soldier with the dignity they deserve. Mitchell sat alone in his office after Chun left, staring at the credentials she had left on his desk as evidence of his catastrophic miscalculation. In the space of a single conversation, he had gone from confident authority to professional destruction, brought down by his own assumptions about rank, gender, and the changing nature of military leadership. The man who had prided himself on never being outmaneuvered by Pentagon bureaucrats had been systematically evaluated and found wanting by exactly the kind of officer he had always dismissed. His attempts to assert dominance over someone he viewed as a threat had instead provided comprehensive evidence of the leadership failures that would now end his career. Outside his office, Fort Harrison continued its daily operations, unaware that their commanding officer had just experienced a reckoning that would change everything about their future. The base Mitchell had built into a model of military efficiency would soon be under new leadership, guided by the evolving principles of military management that he had refused to acknowledge or accept. The final day of Brigadier General Sarah Chin's assessment visit to Fort Harrison dawned with the crisp clarity of a winter morning, though the atmosphere inside the base administrative building was heavy with tension and the weight of impending change. Colonel James Mitchell sat in his office, surrounded by the accumulated documents and memorabilia of 4 years of command, knowing that his military career was effectively over. The night had been sleepless as Mitchell grappled with the reality of his situation. Every interaction with Chun over the past 4 days replayed in his mind with horrifying clarity. Each dismissive comment and condescending gesture now revealed as career-ending mistakes directed at a general officer who possessed both the authority and documentation necessary to destroy him professionally. At 0700, Captain Rodriguez knocked and entered with obvious reluctance, carrying a message from division headquarters that Mitchell had been dreading. The division commander was requesting an immediate conference call to discuss the preliminary findings from Chin's assessment and the future of Mitchell's command. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, his usual confidence replaced by the careful demeanor of someone who sensed that his commanding officer was in serious trouble. "General Harrison wants to speak with you at 0830. He specifically mentioned that General Chun will be participating in the call." Mitchell accepted the message without comment, his mind already working through the impossible task of explaining 4 days of behavior that had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership problems the modern military was trying to eliminate. How could he justify his treatment of someone he had believed to be a junior officer when that treatment revealed fundamental character flaws that made him unsuitable for command? Chin arrived at the base headquarters at precisely 0800, her bearing now unmistakably that of a general officer rather than the lieutenant colonel she had portrayed during her assessment. Word of her true identity had spread quickly through the base's informal communication networks, and the reaction from personnel at every level reflected shock, embarrassment, and concern about the implications for their installation. Staff Sergeant Williams, recently court-martialed for insubordination, watched from the administrative building as Chin passed, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of a soldier who had been vindicated by events beyond his control. The safety concerns he had raised, dismissed by Mitchell as resistance to authority, were now part of a comprehensive assessment that had exposed serious problems with the command climate at Fort Harrison. Lieutenant Martinez, the young officer Chun had interviewed about professional development opportunities, stood at attention as the general passed, her mind racing with the realization that she had been speaking candidly about command issues to someone with the authority to implement fundamental changes to military policy across all installations. At 0815, Mitchell placed the conference call to division headquarters, his voice carefully controlled as he acknowledged the presence of both General Harrison, his immediate superior, and General Chun, whose assessment would determine his professional future. "Colonel Mitchell," General Harrison began, his tone carrying the grave formality reserved for serious disciplinary matters. "General Chun has provided me with a preliminary summary of her findings during her assessment visit to Fort Harrison. I want to give you an opportunity to provide your perspective on these issues before we proceed." Mitchell took a deep breath, knowing that his response would be crucial to whatever limited options might remain available to him. Sir, I acknowledge that my behavior toward General Chun was inappropriate and unprofessional. I made assumptions about her identity and authority that led to conduct unbecoming of an officer. Colonel Mitchell, Chin's voice carried the unmistakable authority of senior command as she joined the conversation. The issue isn't simply your personal behavior toward me. My assessment has identified systemic problems with leadership style, command climate, and adherence to current military personnel policies that extend far beyond our personal interactions. General Harrison's voice reflected the weariness of a senior officer dealing with a subordinate whose career was effectively over. Colonel Mitchell, General Chin's report documents multiple instances of authoritarian leadership, resistance to policy guidance, and suppression of legitimate concerns from subordinate personnel. The Staff Sergeant Williams' court-martial appears to be symptomatic of broader problems with your approach to command. Mitchell felt the walls closing in around him as the full scope of Chin's assessment became clear. She hadn't simply documented his inappropriate behavior toward her. She had built a comprehensive case against his entire leadership philosophy and management style. Sir, Mitchell said, making one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career, I've maintained superior operational readiness scores and achieved excellent results in every measurable category of base performance. My leadership methods may be traditional, but they've produced consistently outstanding outcomes. Chin's response was delivered with the clinical precision of someone who had anticipated and prepared for this exact argument. Colonel Mitchell, operational efficiency achieved through suppression of legitimate concerns and intimidation of subordinate personnel is not sustainable in modern military operations. Your methods may have produced short-term results, but they've created long-term problems that compromise unit effectiveness and personnel welfare. General Harrison's voice carried finality as he delivered the decision that Mitchell had been dreading since Chin's true identity was revealed. Colonel Mitchell, based on General Chin's assessment and the documentation she has provided, I'm relieving you of command effective immediately. Colonel Sarah Rodriguez from the 3rd Infantry Division will assume temporary command of Fort Harrison pending assignment of a permanent replacement. The words hit Mitchell with the force of a physical blow, confirming the end of everything he had built over 4 years of dedicated service. His pride in Fort Harrison's achievements, his confidence in his leadership abilities, and his faith in traditional military hierarchies had all been shattered by a general officer who had systematically exposed the fundamental flaws in his approach to command. Additionally, General Harrison continued, you will report to the Pentagon for a comprehensive leadership review and possible reassignment to duties more appropriate to your capabilities and experience level. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality that Mitchell was being sent to Washington for professional rehabilitation that might or might not result in continued service. At his rank and age, relief from command typically meant early retirement or assignment to meaningless administrative positions that would allow him to serve out his remaining years without responsibility for personnel or operations. Chin's voice concluded the conference call with devastating precision. Colonel Mitchell, I want you to understand that this outcome wasn't predetermined when I arrived at Fort Harrison. Your treatment of subordinate personnel, resistance to policy guidance, and inappropriate behavior toward visiting officers created this situation through your own choices and actions. After the call ended, Mitchell sat alone in his office for the final time, surrounded by the awards, commendations, and photographs that documented 30 years of military service now ending in professional disgrace. The man who had never been outmaneuvered by Pentagon bureaucrats had been systematically evaluated and found wanting by exactly the kind of officer he had always dismissed. Outside his office, Fort Harrison buzzed with the news of the command change and the remarkable story of the lieutenant colonel who had turned out to be a brigadier general conducting a covert assessment. Personnel at every level discussed the implications for their own careers and the future direction of military leadership standards. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had testified reluctantly during the Williams court-martial, reflected on the painful lessons about speaking truth to power and the importance of command climates that encouraged rather than suppressed legitimate concerns from experienced personnel. Private Morrison, whose injury during the modified training exercise had become evidence of broader safety issues, wondered about the changes that might come to training procedures and safety protocols under new leadership more responsive to soldier welfare. Staff Sergeant Williams, vindicated by events beyond his control, contemplated the complex relationship between military discipline and moral courage, recognizing that his court-martial had become a catalyst for addressing problems much larger than his individual case. Lieutenant Martinez thought about her career prospects under military leadership that valued innovation and independent thinking rather than blind obedience to authority, realizing that Chin's assessment represented a generational shift in expectations for military officers. General Chun completed her final documentation of the Fort Harrison assessment, knowing that her report would become a case study in modern military